through the experience of a World War II combat medic. This is my research project that I'm proposing. This is a project that I felt has not been touched much, and because of the fact that it's not been touched, no one's really looked at the fact of combat medics, nor have there has been some extensive research into PTSD, but we really haven't seen where it's actually looked at through a non-combatant, especially World War II. World War II is where you have a higher incident of non-combatants who were in this area and that would be affected by PTSD. So, first things that come up, one of the things that really you have to think about, war itself has been just like mankind and everything else, it always has evolved. It started since there have been civilizations, there have been wars over land, over money, over property, over politics. And as long as there's been war, there have been injuries, there have been those who had to take care of them. And even the fact that you have mental disorders that actually have been associated with them as well. PTSD has actually been traced all the way back to the Greece, to ancient Greece, and to the Greek wars. There's actually documented cases where one of a warrior actually had what today would be called psychosomatic blindness. He was in the middle of a battle and seen such great horrific things that his mind finally shut off and said, "I don't want to see no more," and he couldn't see. We do know that PTSD has actually been it's been very misunderstood all the way from those times to today. When you think all the way back to the Civil War and before, you'd hear them consider them cowards, cowardice. Later you'd hear such things as shell shock, railway spine, battle fatigue, and finally it evolved into what we call PTSD. Now, the fact that you have a stigma that really is associated with a lot of mental disorders, you'll find that there were many of the individuals who in World War II went undiagnosed with PTSD because the fact that it had such a stigma. Most generals and that really wanted them out of the battlefield so they would not infect the others. There was a slight case in World War I where one of the doctors actually came up and started to treat it with the individual actually being near the front in the hospital. Same thing happened that actually then of course in World War II we actually see one American neurosurgeon who actually started up this practice as well. And on the same note, as I said, PTSD really didn't come into its own until around Vietnam, just afterwards. The same thing as I mentioned, that you always have had people who've cared for those who are wounded. That includes surgeons, doctors, and everything else. But one of the things that kind of evolved and also started around World War II, as the same time that you see real treatment for PTSD, were combat medics. These were the guys who were actually out on the line. They usually were undertrained, under experienced. They had a lot of times were not seen for who they were or what they were. When they were in training before the war, most of the troops disliked them. When they were during the combats and everything, they were the doc. They were the guy who was out there who was going to save their life. But yeah, as I said, it's a very relatively new field that we actually see within the art of war, and it starts up around World War II, about the same time that we start seeing real treatment to PTSD.
Okay, I'm gonna stop for a second.
All right, and as I mentioned, we will be looking at PTSD. When I start doing this, I'm going to actually start digging deeper into the history of it, where we start seeing it. As I said, there is a point in ancient Greece where we actually hear of this warrior. I still have some more research to come into, but I do believe there is a article that does talk about some treatment of him. But that's something I still have to find yet. I've only heard about and need to actually look into it. We noticed that in looking through it, as I said, it really had a very negative connotation in the time period up until the mid part or the early parts of World War II, where they actually is finally getting actually is more towards mid World War II, where you actually see where it's actually being treated. You actually see Captain Hansen actually coming across and saying, this is how we really treat it. This is what happens if we leave them up front, we keep them up here, they'll get better, and we can send them back up into fight. Before, when they ship them off back into the back, only thing that would happen is these patients would get worse. They would actually start to have this point where they were just really despise themselves because they weren't with their troops. They felt like they were cowards and they couldn't handle the situation, and because of their cowardness, that's why they were pulled away. And you start developing a lot of issues. One of the other things that must be noted is PTSD is still very much missed even today. When we look at PTSD, one of the things in 2012, we note that 22 veterans a day commit suicide. That's not a week, that's not a year, that's a day. And that's 22 members of people that should not have committed suicide because their ghosts turned to demons. And that's why it is. Their memories have become so haunting that they've actually brought physical harm upon them. And it's something that we need to look into. We need to start correcting. And we also need to be looking at the fact that you have medics, you have other individuals who are affected by PTSD. It's one of the studies I find and that we see with is that it isn't just combat troops that are affected. Anybody who has had any sort of trauma, whether it be a person who has been emotionally, physically abused, those who have gone off into civilian emergencies and have seen such horrific injury and damage to people. All these people are all affected by PTSD, and we still have high numbers of suicides and that related to that. It's something that we really need to be looking into and studying and seeing that it's not just combat troops. It's also the fact that what causes it, how this happens, what can we do to fix this. But this is something that needs to be studied, and we got to look at the past. We got to look at where we see it and see these people were affected by it. This is what happened, and this is kind of why I'm looking into this, why I'm looking into the medics and looking into what they had gone through. And by going through that, looking through the signs and symptoms, which you'll see signs and symptoms, and some of the people that you'll run across in these medics that I've been reading about, and you'll see some of the horrors that they face. One of the medics that I was reading, which his story is being told by his brother-in-law. In this story, his brother-in-law's telling the people that his brother-in-law, one, does not talk about what he done in World War II. He doesn't talk about everything he's seen. And when he finally opens up, when he finds out that his brother-in-law is going into the military and he knows that he's going to be seeing these things, sort of as a warning, this is what I've seen, he starts going into it. He starts relating these tales. And one of the things that haunts him is the soldiers that he personally had to pronounce dead. The soldiers, in the title of the book, it says, I've closed too many eyes. And it talks about how he actually pronounced these people dead, how he closed the eyes. And it's something that affected him. And you'll see that these are some of the... and we'll talk about, as I said, some of these medics. We'll be talking about him. We'll be talking about Doss. And Doss, who of course is made famous by Hacksaw Ridge. We'll talk about another individual who is Rains, who actually was a Jewish medic, and this sort of stigma that him and Doss also received because of their religion and because how religious they were. Doss, who was a conscientious objector due to his religion and to his religious practice. We'll note, as I mentioned, a lot of these guys were well undertrained. They'd only get maybe a week's training of a doctor sitting there lecturing to them what they were going to have to do, and they were sent off. They never actually bandaged anybody. They never treated wounds. They never even seen them up until they actually were stuck in the thick of battle. And of course, they're going to be sitting there. You're going to look at these horrors of war that are coming out. You've seen from World War I, as we're now switching from swords and people marching towards each other, shooting bullets at each other, to machine guns just mowing and chopping people up, to artillery that is sending shells the size of a car at the enemy, and they're just literally obliterating whoever they're hit. Bodies that have been laying unattended to, that have started to decompose and that have started to actually rot, and they're now having to come across these people and have to deal with this. These are the sort of things that these people had to actually see, deal with. And it's something that is very stressful and very, of course, has all these do lead to the causes of PTSD. And of course, we'll look at some of the combat. I'll be looking through some of the combat troops, and we'll be talking about all the situations, as I noted, that what these guys see, what they end up having to deal with, and then of course, as I mentioned about Doss, and you'll look at Rains, and there's some other individuals which I'm going to also go who are noted who have PTSD from Vietnam. Those, we're going to look at some medics from Korea. We're going to look at some medics from today's wars in Afghanistan who actually have documented PTSD. We're going to kind of look at them. We're also going to use them to kind of look at these medics in the past and from World War II. We're going to kind of compare what these medics are going through and what these others had gone through. And we're going to look at these and kind of compare them and kind of give a showing that these people actually had this back then, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. Of course, on our primary resources, some of the stuff, as I mentioned, about Paul Arness and his recounts of his brother-in-law, and Desmond Doss. We're going to look at Robert Franklin, who talks about how just he was out there working on people with just bandages, morphine, sulfa. John Kearns, he was a combat medic during World War II as well. And then, as I said, Herman Rains, who was a Jewish medic who had the issues from. Then in the secondary, we're going to actually look at Anthony Babington and his shell shock and the changing attitudes that you see the start to change their views. And it's another thing that we're going to kind of look at Charles Boner, and he's talking about the scars you can't see. It's one of the things that is well noted and well talked about, is that when you come back with PTSD, when you come back with these psychological issues, they're scars you cannot see. a bullet hole through your flesh will leave a scar as the adipose tissue underneath comes out and is shown. But those who have these mental issues, the scars, you can't see them, but they're there. They live through these things. And of course, we look at Stephen Hinshaw, he's going to talk about the stigma. He's going to sit there and kind of look at this point that we're kind of pointing out that there is a stigma that comes with those who have any sort of mental illness. And it's going to be through his works that we're going to kind of bring this out. We're going to point out this is why this attributes to why a lot of these things were probably not reported. Then, of course, we're going to look at Edgar Jones and his study from shell shock all the way to PTSD. It's another one where he's kind of looking through the different cases of PTSD throughout the time period. And as I said, why is this important? There's so few accounts of this. This is something that really, really needs to come into being, something that really needs to be examined, brought out, and actually put together. Then, of course, we know that, as I said, we've seen that both medics and PTSD, and we've seen there's a lot of information about it, and it's evolving, it's growing, but we need more awareness to it to help it evolve, to help bring a lot of closure to those who've had it, those who can, and then also bring help that they can actually get over the cases that they have, to get them past the issues so they can grow from there. And there's sort of a need to acknowledge what the medics face, what they actually do, and the fact that they do deal with this PTSD. They do end up catching it, and there's a need to acknowledge all the other non-combatants who also come up with it, because it isn't just your medics. You're going to see doctors, you're going to see nurses, chaplains. The chaplain has to go out, they have to give last rites to these people. And it can be overwhelming when you see some of the grievous wounds and the damage that these people have gone through. My grandmother to date has never, till her dying day, always believed that her son was going to return home because he was blown in half by a landmine. He did not have he had a closed casket. They'd never seen him. It was sealed. She'd always hoped that they put the wrong body in and he would come home. This is something that people deal with. This is something that really needs to come to light, and something that really needs to be explored as we see that these people, not the combatants who actually inflicting the damage and seeing it firsthand, but the other people that are seeing it as it's coming back and as it's going through, and the stress that they go through, and the PTSD that they deal with. This is why I feel that this research project has great potential. It's something that's not hardly ever covered, and it's something that really needs to be dug into through looking first at the medics, the friends who deal with it firsthand, and then traveling backwards and traveling in time, as well as through the chain of people who are affected. Thank you.